This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
Well, thank you very much, Lori, for that kind introduction. And for all of you, or to all of you, for coming out tonight. This is a great crowd, and it's just amazing what IHMC is doing in Ocala and Pensacola. This is really, in a sense, when I come back to IHMC, bringing coal to Newcastle, because there is cutting-edge research being done in the area that I'm passionately devoted to, and that is preventing disease and not just treating them once we have them. So that's why you're here tonight, and that's what I want to talk about tonight. It's amazing, and let me just say this, that I don't know of any institution anywhere, academic, research, or otherwise, that makes this kind of investment in community education. It's truly exceptional, and I believe unique. When you look at what Ken Ford and his colleagues have done since the early 2000s, just in reaching out with these evening lectures, and with his STEM talks. Going back to the first episode with Peter Attia, who is an expert in the field and somebody I'll talk about in a moment. But throughout these years, over 20 years, these talks have featured probably more of the experts in the area of healthy longevity than any series I can think of. And so I'm proud to be with you tonight as just one of many who are speaking to this topic. And of course, we come at it from different angles, but the important thing is for us to work together to do what can be done as fast as possible to find ways to slow the development of age-related chronic diseases and disabilities. Now, since 2017, our organization has been putting on a conference. It started in London, but has continued to be put on annually. And we've had almost as many speakers as the IHMC series. But we do that just once a year. And so in our small way, we're trying to do the same kind of thing that Ken Ford and his colleagues are doing. This past year, we have changed the name from targeting meta-obesity, and I'll explain that term in just a moment, to, and just to say that Ken himself has participated in our conference series, along with Dr. Morley Stone, when they gave a really great session on ketones in health and disease. But what we're now calling the conference is Targeting Healthy Longevity, because I think this better expresses what we're aiming to do or to accomplish. And our foundation, the Catalyst Institute, is doing other things besides just putting on a conference. We, for example, have an effort to increase federal funding of projects that will lead to progress in this area. We're also working with the FDA to accelerate the development of products that could improve healthspan and healthy longevity. Our most recent speaker in this year's conference was the commissioner of FDA, Dr. Rob Califf. So we have a close relationship with the FDA, and we see that as a very important target for achieving a better understanding of the roadblocks that small companies are having and trying to develop their products to target healthy longevity. Now, tonight, we're going to cover just a few examples of the spectacular progress that's been made in understanding the biology of aging and how these advances point to ways that healthspan, or what we call healthy longevity, can be increased. We'll be speaking about some of the drugs that are under development for slowing the aging process and increasing health span. And we'll talk about how tough it is to get the kind of evidence that we need to put products on the market that could slow the aging process. And we'll end up with how we as individuals can increase our own healthy longevity and do it now, start doing it now. Now, these are my parents back when they were in their late 80s. They had wonderfully productive parallel careers, mutually supporting each other and achieving great things. And they were active even up to this point. They're in their late 80s in this picture, but 5 years later, they both had died within just a few months of each other. And you know the story. People can be doing relatively well, and suddenly they go into a very rapid point of decline in physical function and in cognition. And so this is not anything that is not well known to you, either by personal experience or from observing other people around you. And so this is really what we are focusing on. How can we slow this decline that tends to start to accelerate in the very end of life? And we believe that ultimately we can modulate the rate of aging and help people to live a productive life for a longer period of time. So people are living longer. We know people are living longer, but also we see around us all the sad disabilities from the chronic diseases that they start to pile up. And the healthcare costs are just going through the roof. And so it's almost an unsustainable proposition that we're able to keep people going, but they are in a very diseased and disabled state, and no one wants that. So younger generations cannot bear the burden of this kind of economic and personal burden. So can we live longer, or at least have a longer period of our years free of chronic disease? And I would say, yes, absolutely. The science is telling us that we can. And concern for younger generations says that we should. And the economics say that we must. We've got to be able to stem the tide of aging and the consequences that go along with it. So the science is spectacular. We won't go into more than just quickly mentioning a few examples. We now know how to reprogram cells, such as these Nobel Prize winners were able to do back in the early 2000s. And that work is continuing to accelerate so that we're able to control cellular processes and even reverse the aging at the cellular and organ levels, and even in experimental animals. We're able to target old cells, which are causing a lot of the complications of aging. We believe that because these cells that hang around they are having negative effects on healthy cells. And so we're learning more about targeting cells that are doing no good, and we need to get and find a better way of handling them. Another experiment that is very, I think, intriguing is that you can hook up a young mouse and an old mouse, their circulations, and the young mouse will get older and the older mouse will get younger. Don't try that at home. But this is a real study that was done, and so the conclusion, of course, is that there is something in the circulation that is having an effect on the aging process, at least in these rodents. And then there have been more recent studies where damaged or aged tissue has been able to be regenerated. And in this case, sight has actually been restored in an experimental animal. And this is just incredible to behold. So it has led to a field that we call geroscience. And just to understand that term, it's a multidisciplinary field, but it all centers around believing that there are biological mechanisms that underlie the aging process and age-related diseases. And the main goal of geroscience is to find these root causes, target them with the prospects that you could slow multiple forms of aging and slow the onset of more than several chronic diseases. So the geroscience hypothesis is that most, probably all, chronic diseases that we know well, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative disease, and even cancer, share root causes. There are already very well identified drivers of these multiple but very different kinds of chronic diseases. And so the idea is that if you can target a root cause of these multiple diseases, you can have an impact across the spectrum of chronic diseases. It's still a hypothesis, at least for humans. Now, we actually have data in lower animals that this, in fact, is operating, that there is truly a underlying set of aging drivers that can be modified, and the aging process can thereby be slowed down. Now, the term metabesity is a term that I coined some time ago that is meant to express the target of what we're trying to achieve. Metabesity is not just some wider form of obesity. It's the constellation of all these chronic diseases and cancer, which do appear to be driven by shared root causes. And if we can identify effective ways of intervening against these root causes, then we can thereby achieve multiple benefits across the spectrum of human disease. So just a couple of other definitions. Lifespan is obvious, but healthspan you'll hear me talking about frequently. It's very simply the period of life that is free of chronic diseases and disabilities. And that is what we want to increase. Now, at a lecture that was recently given by Marcus Baumann, who is a preeminent expert that is working in Pensacola at IHMC, He gave what I think is a very good way of looking at these terms, particularly health span. It's the portion of a person's life during which they are in generally good health. That's good for me. And I like this diagram that he showed. And what it depicts on the lower line is the decline that starts to take, the decline in health that starts around age 30 and progressively decreases. The idea of increasing health span is that we can slow that relentless decline and keep it level for a longer period of time. Now, we may not be able to increase lifespan by that much. There may be fundamental biologic limitations to how long we can live as human beings. But what we do believe we can achieve is this increased health span. That's the shaded area. It would be the result of people living with less disease, less disability, and maybe living a bit longer, but nonetheless being functional for a greater part of their lives. So what stands in the way of converting the science that you've seen, and there's a lot more, into solutions for increasing health span? Well, as you know, we can't just take a discovery from the laboratory directly to a person. What it takes is first doing a lot of clinical studies, and these can take decades. And we need to get those data to be able to go to FDA and get them to approve the product. But it's not over then. It still is a matter of having the evidence that the product is worth paying for. And so you need additional evidence to support the value of the product. And then you also need to convince the prescribers to use the product. So getting all that evidence is expensive and very time-consuming before that discovery finally comes back to you and me. So the big problem is that right now, the way things are currently set up with our regulatory structure and the way that biomedical research is done across the globe, is that it's going to take decades and billions of dollars to get these products that we're yearning for to people. And for some of us, it's going to be too late. So how do we get pills and other interventions that will increase health span? Let me take a while to walk you through some technical details that I think will be important for you to understand. First, if we take a new discovery, a new drug, about the fastest way we could get it on the market is to target a so-called orphan disease indication. So if you start with that lab discovery and you do the necessary testing in animals, and then you get into human studies, phase 1, 2, and 3, about the fastest you could get a drug from the lab to the person is on the order, or the better part of 10 years. And that's the best case. Now, if you're going after a chronic disease, for a condition like type 2 diabetes, it can take much longer. And now you can start and have these two different programs in parallel, one for the major disease indication and one for the orphan condition. You don't have to go in this sequence. But even if you start right away in developing the data you need to get the product approved for, say, diabetes, it's going to take the better part of 10 years. Now, that's just to treat diabetes. That's not what we're all interested about tonight. That is a product that young people could take, or at least younger people could take who are healthy, and do so to actually avert getting the disease. And that proposition takes a much longer time, just the way things are. So let's take, for example, a drug that relatively recently was approved for diabetes. It took about 4 years for the product to be approved. Well, backing up, it actually took about 10 years of research before the product was approved for type 2 diabetes. But then studies were done. It took about 4 years to get an approval for treatment of obesity. And then it took another 4 years to get an indication for the reduction of risk of cardiovascular disease. And so that is actually the case study of a drug that I'm going to tell you about in a moment. But as far as an indication for preventing multiple chronic diseases, this drug was actually a candidate, but for a reason I'll show you in a moment, it no longer, it's kind of being left in the dust. But the point is, this is about the best we can do right now. We start with a drug that's already approved for some condition. It could be diabetes, it could be cardiovascular disease. We have enough understanding of its safety that we can then not have to spend as much time before we can do a major study to show that it reduces the risk of multiple chronic diseases. Here is the kind of end result that is needed to show that a drug reduces the risk of a condition. And in this case, this is the drug liraglutide. It's the drug we've been talking about. It was first approved for diabetes and then for obesity. And then they did a study of about 17,000 patients to be able to show these data. This shows that the placebo patients had a greater risk compared to the people who got liraglutide. Now, the risk reduction was only about 10%, but it was clinically meaningful and statistically significant. And so these data were enough for FDA to give the indication for reducing cardiovascular risk. But note that that involves 17,000 patients, and that also involves a lot of money, and it's a 5-year trial. So if we take a long approved drug, one, say, that's approved for diabetes, to get to the kind of approval that we're looking for, that is to reduce the aging process or the progress or the progression of age-related diseases, it will take anywhere from 4 to 10 years, depending on the kind of design that is used to get the evidence. So I mentioned that liraglutide is no longer a candidate for the kind of indication we're looking for, because the company, Novo, has come up with an even better, more potent drug, and you've been hearing about it. This is one of the miracle drugs that are causing people with diabetes to actually go into remission, and they're causing huge loss of weight in people with obesity. And semaglutide just recently was shown to reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease, not just in people who are diabetic and already have cardiovascular disease, but in this case, Novo invested in a study of people who were not diabetic. They had in general, lower risk of cardiovascular disease. And they showed a 20% reduction in the risk of cardiovascular disease. That's twice as good as liraglutide. And so the focus now is on semaglutide and perhaps an even more potent drug from Lilly called tirzepatide. And that drug, along with a few other things at Lilly, has caused Lilly to be the pharmaceutical company that has the highest market cap in the entire world. And it's largely based on these mega blockbusters, at least aimed at diabetes and obesity. And we're hoping that they're also going to be deployed against neurodegenerative disease, chiefly dementia, but also potentially Parkinson's and other neurologic disorders. And yet, the problem is that Novo had to spend probably over $200 million to do this trial, and it took 5 years. And remember, these are still people who had obesity and they had some degree of cardiovascular disease. If we were to do a study in healthy people, it would take 5 times the amount of money to do a study large enough to be able to detect the benefit that would be convincing to allow exposure of a larger population to this kind of drug. So that is a big predicament. And what it means is that we're forced to look to drugs that are already approved for purposes of slowing the aging process. And there are 2 drugs that are now being used by a lot of people, even some of my colleagues, I think, on thin evidence that we have right now for slowing the aging process. So I think you probably heard about metformin. And by the way, I approved metformin back in the 90s against a lot of opposition. There were a lot of so-called experts who said that it should not be approved because it was related to a drug that was similar in chemical structure and had caused some serious problems back in the 70s. But the evidence was clear that metformin was free of that risk, and so we approved it, and it has subsequently become the first-line treatment for type 2 diabetes. And now, and we'll go into the evidence in a moment, it is a candidate for targeting healthy longevity. Rapamycin is the other drug. We'll talk a bit about that too. They work in similar, or let's say related ways in the metabolic pathways that have to do with energy homeostasis in the body. And without getting into the details, let's just say that these are maybe the best candidates we have now for doing long-term clinical trials that could result in a product being approved for increasing health span. So there was a paper, this paper came out in 2014, and essentially the conclusion was that people who were diabetic and on metformin actually lived longer than age-matched controls, people that did not have diabetes. And so this set into motion a whole lot of thinking and planning about a trial that could be done to show that metformin actually would slow the aging process. The interpretation was that metformin could actually reduce the risk of multiple chronic diseases and cancer. And we'll come back to the study that is being proposed in a moment. There was, however, I caution to add recently a study that, or a paper that evaluated not only these data, but they did a very sophisticated study of twins. And this allows a robust comparison of people who have the same genetic background and can also be studied for differences when they have different diseases like diabetes. Bottom line is, these authors found that metformin was not associated with a survival benefit. In other words, they refuted the findings of that previous study. And if you want to get into the details of why the first study was flawed, then I recommend Peter Attia. You remember he was one of the people, one of the original speakers that Ken Ford had in his series. He actually goes into this in a lot of detail. And it's really quite important to understand how epidemiology can be misused or not entirely interpreted correctly, as I think is the case of that earlier paper. Nonetheless, we're taking this long-approved drug, metformin, which we do understand seems to affect a number of pathways that would seem to favor the slowing of the aging process. So in theory, metformin looks good, and it has a good safety profile. It's fairly well tolerated by people. Some people are not able to take it, but by and large, it could be used by a large, healthy population. And so what has been proposed is a clinical trial called TAME, and you may have read about this. This proposal has been around for now 8 years. The study would actually involve people who are relatively healthy, they'd be older, but free of chronic disease. And as the study is currently planned, 3,000 people would be studied, and it would be entirely controlled. The primary outcome of this trial would be the time to occurrence of any major chronic disease and cancer. And then there would be other benefits of the study that would be assessed, but the main study would be to come up again with a result just like we looked at earlier, whether there's a difference between the rates of people developing one or any one of these diseases with placebo. And even if it were just a 10% reduction, that would, for metformin, in my opinion, it would be certainly an approvable indication. However, I'm skeptical. The study is too small as planned to be able to detect anywhere near a 10% difference without getting into the statistics involved. I just think that the current proposal is underpowered, and unfortunately, there has not been anyone willing to step up to fund the trial. NIH has turned it down, and many private benefactors have likewise chosen to take a pass. So that leaves us with rapamycin, and this is a drug that some of you may know is used for people who've had a solid organ transplant, typically kidney transplant. It's to control the immune attack against the transplanted organ. So it actually decreases immune function. That's not a great thing, particularly after we've been through COVID and the lessons of that era. But there are some good cases to be made for rapamycin. And Ken and I were talking about this earlier. Ken told me, and I shouldn't be putting this on you, Ken, but He understands that there may be 2 million people in this country who are taking rapamycin off-label. It's a cheap drug, and you can get it if your physician will prescribe it or you find some other way to get it. I don't think the evidence is supporting that yet. There is sufficient downside that I would not suggest doing it myself, but many experts in the field are rolling the dice with rapamycin. So there's another twist to how we could use such a drug, and that would be to actually target our immune system, actually improving the immune system. And so my colleague Joan Manick has taken rapamycin and found a more selective molecule that has less of the downside of rapamycin and actually seems to improve the immune system by working at fundamental locations in the metabolism of humans. And this was no idle talk. They actually did a study, a fairly large study, that showed that their new drug actually decreased the numbers of people developing confirmed upper respiratory infections. These were older people, and a large enough study was done to show that this drug actually made a difference in the rates of getting an upper respiratory infection. Now, these were all kinds of infections, including the flu, but in theory, a drug that could reduce infections could have a significant effect on our well-being individually and certainly for our public health system. But they did a phase 3 study, and it was much larger, and they were not able to confirm the result. And ultimately, the drug did not make it to the market. But they came close, and there were some reasons to understand why the phase 3 results did not confirm the phase 2 results. I think there is an underlying effect of that drug in reducing upper respiratory infections, but you need more than just a single study to be able to get the product on the market. Another twist on rapamycin, going back to the original drug, is the dog study that Matt Chamberlain, remember he was one of the speakers more recently in an IHMC program. This is a study of about 6,000 dogs nationwide, and I don't know the status. I believe probably they've closed enrollment of dogs, but at one point you could have entered your dog if you wanted to. But it's placebo controlled, so you would not necessarily get the drug. But this is an important study. It would be highly convincing to me if Matt Chamberlain should show a survival benefit in dogs, that we would likewise expect some kind of effect in humans. So this is an important study, and it could change my opinion on the value of rapamycin as a way of slowing the aging process. But right now, I think the evidence is insufficient to recommend using it. Well, what can you do to increase your health span? And before we leave drugs, let's just leave you with a take-home point. And that is, of all these drugs that are out there to treat diseases, it's clear that they are efficacious, but just because they work against a disease does not mean that they're going to work in healthy people to prevent the disease. It's a logical assumption that they would or could, but it will need to be proved. So what can you do? And you may be thinking, you're really depressing me. You're telling me we're decades away from anything. Maybe we'll have a dog study that will give some encouragement. Is there any possibility, you might ask, if a breakthrough could lead to an anti-aging drug that could be approved within a decade? And I would say it is possible if we had a so-called senolytic drug, a drug that actually breaks up the aged molecules or aged cells and helps the body to get rid of them. This would reverse the aging process. And if it reverses it, then it's much easier to measure and to see that effect in a shorter period of time. But I caution to add, don't waste your money on these products. There are dozens and dozens on the internet that are being marketed as senolytic drugs. Of course, they're not drugs, they're dietary supplements. They don't have FDA approval in the way drugs do. And it's the wild, wild west. You can buy just about anything on the internet, but caveat emptor. Let's talk about what you can do to increase your health span. Dietary supplements, almost without exception, are not going to do anything for you except reduce your bank account. Avoid taking any product that doesn't have longer-term data to back up these claims. Short studies where you show that rats live a little longer, don't buy that. There are a lot of drugs that do that, but they've been proved not to work in humans. And these products have been making a lot of money for companies, nicotinamide-related drugs that are NAD boosters, so-called. They do have some science behind them. They even have some very well-known scientists behind them. But I think it's almost fraudulent to be marketing these products with healthy longevity claims. So again, not high on most dietary, just about all dietary supplements. There is one product that has, it's sort of a unicorn. It's a drug that, or not a drug, it's a product that some of you may be taking called Cocavia. Now, the big difference here is that a large clinical outcome trial was done with the active ingredient in Cocavia. It's an extract of the cocoa bean. It's a product of Mars. You wouldn't guess that Mars would have a healthy product, but they actually have invested a great deal in these flavanol products, a lot of science. And they do reduce blood pressure. They have other beneficial effects that can be measured in a short period of time. And so they finally teamed up with Harvard and they did a 20,000 person study. And the evidence they came up with is pretty encouraging, that it not only reduces cardiovascular risk, but there are several sub-studies that they did that show that it improves cognition. Not necessarily permanently, but it improves cognition for as long as the product is being taken. So this is a very rare case of a company that had enough money. It's one of the wealthiest private companies in the world. They had enough money to invest in this trial. But few dietary supplement companies are ever going to do this kind of study. And if they did, we would be much better served. The problem with the dietary supplement industry is that there is no incentive to do that kind of long-term research, because the way dietary supplements are dealt with by the patent office, you just really can't patent these products. And so if you show your product works well, you can easily be competed with the next day by somebody saying they've got the same product. So that's just a quirk of our system. There's no incentive to do the kind of research that's needed for dietary supplements. Well, you may ask, how and when will we have the means of living longer but healthier? And I would say now. We do have the means now. We don't have drugs. We don't have dietary supplements. But we do have things that you know about. And I don't want to make this preachy, but we do know what works. We have abundant evidence that it's not only safe, but it's effective. The first would be lifestyle changes. And you know it well. Be more physically active, eat a good diet, maintain a normal body weight, of course, no smoking. These are all no-brainers. Got abundant evidence that it works. The one thing I wish I had added was sleep. This is my big problem. I don't get enough sleep. And it's actually a very important determinant of the aging process. And we could spend a whole lecture, and in fact, there is a lecture, an IHMC lecture on sleep, which I commend to you. But these are known, but they're not easy. Let's admit it. And so they're not, we know they're out there, and we just don't avail ourselves as much as we should. The other important thing is social support. We're going to be having a webinar in just a couple of weeks, and I hope you'll listen in, on loneliness. You've heard about loneliness as being a major public health issue. In fact, if you are in a condition of chronic loneliness, it represents a risk factor, according to the Surgeon General, who's done an impressive study. It's equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And we know now how it affects intermediary metabolism, loneliness. It can actually exacerbate type 2 diabetes. And it's a vicious cycle, because having diabetes can tend to make you isolated and lonely. So I can't overemphasize the need for strong social support, family and community. And then having a positive outlook. Lots of evidence to back that up. Easier said than done, I know, but we do have the evidence to support it. And so I do believe you can increase your health span just by following the science. This represents a way of keeping your mind active and engaged, and perhaps learning to do things that are better or worse for you. And one example is the kind of work that Marcus Baumann is doing in Pensacola. They are looking at practical questions about what is the optimal intensity of exercise, what is the optimal duration of exercise. They're doing this in the lab, very sophisticated technology, and this is cutting-edge science, and it's well worth following. So follow the science, and don't be misled by anything but science. There is sciencey stuff, but there is really just science, and that means having good controls, long duration of follow-up, and all the other things that go into having solid experimental results. So the take-home message is that geroscience is amazing. It's not if, but when these major solutions to slowing aging will come. And there is solid evidence for safe, for some things we can do today, but right now we don't have evidence for a pill that can increase health span. And that evidence, at a minimum, is a decade away. But in the meantime, of course, avoid the hype and misinformation that abounds in this field, and seize control of your own healthy longevity program. And that includes all the things that I mentioned, and you know well. Many evidence-based solutions are available now, and it helps for you to do whatever will increase your activity level, improve your diet, keep your body weight down, avoid too much alcohol and tobacco, all these things that we all know. So keep informed, ultimately, and do support the quest. Keep coming to these events, and it will tend to make you younger. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zan. So, do we have questions? Okay, I see 1, 2. All right. I'm going to go to the back first and then come up here. Okay. Olivia.
Hi. Okay, I have so many questions. I'll give you 2, though. In regards to the FDA-approved medications that are used for other things, my concern is the side effects. Are they, if you're using a drug for one thing and you're using it for something else, it gets approved for something else, are the side effects the same, or are they different depending on what illness you have?
Well, I think that's really the big problem, is that we don't know until we test the drug in that other population. We don't know whether it's going to be effective, but to your point, we don't know if it's going to be safe in that population. There may be a different safety profile, and so that's a good reason to avoid using a drug that hasn't been tested for a particular condition.
Okay, that sounds like rolling the dice to me. Okay, my second question is, as far as Eastern and Western medicine goes, I know they've been doing a lot of studies recently on the use of different kinds of mushrooms. How is that going in regards to getting medications for that?
Well, it's a very active area of research, as you point out. Psilocybin and other botanical products have had a long tradition of use in both cultures. And indeed, we're seeing really very encouraging data for use in people with depression, drug abuse, and other addictions. So I think there's a real role there. But again, we don't have enough data to make it widely available. And going back to your earlier point, we need the evidence of both safety and effectiveness in the population that's being treated.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I think we have one up here, sir. Yes. Okay. Do you after that?
Dr. Fleming, I was interested in the rapamycin being an immunosuppressant, and it may show some anti-aging capabilities. There's another class of drugs that's in wide use now, the biologics, like Humira, that are also immunosuppressants. Is there any evidence that they provide any anti-aging capability?
It's a great question, because inflammation is one of these root cause drivers of the aging process. And so you might assume that a drug, these anti-TNF inhibitors like Humira, that there might be a role for controlling the immune system, the immune attack that, or the inflammatory processes that contribute to the aging process. Now, we don't have evidence yet of an anti-aging effect for Humira or related products. And as you know, there are a number. And by the way, Humira, until these recent blockbusters that we talked about, was by far the biggest moneymaker of any pharmaceutical. But that is for serious autoimmune diseases, rheumatoid arthritis being the first indication approved. And yet, if you look in the label, the fine print on the package of the drug, you'll see all kinds of warnings, because when you do big studies of Humira, you'll see a higher rate of serious infections, even death. You see in epidemiologic and larger clinical studies increases in cancer. So we definitely see a downside to those agents, but in a smaller dose, there could be an anti-aging effect. I would certainly agree.
We have Mehdi.
Thank you very much, sir. It was wonderful. Thank you for the thought-provoking presentation. My name is Sheni Meghani, and I'm a geriatrician and a palliative care specialist. And I just say this because I could be the potential prescriber, and I think that comes with a different set of challenges. As prescribers, we are convinced and we are being told that polypharmacy is a huge problem, and for every reason there is a pill, if not one, maybe three. And what would you say to a prescriber, a confused prescriber like me? Thank you, sir.
Well, this is the key question. What are you at the front line of healthcare to do? When a 40-year-old woman comes in saying, my mother has dementia, my father has heart disease, what am I to do? What drugs will you prescribe for me? The evidence, unfortunately, doesn't support a lot that you can do for this middle-aged person. It only starts to get to the point where people have diseases that you have plenty of medicines you can prescribe. But as you know, they have their limitations. So I would have to say that we really are, in some ways, no better off than we were a century ago when my grandfather was practicing medicine. But, you know, the best thing you could do is just be a good doctor, a good hand holder. And we've had amazing advances, but we still have a long way to go, and being able to offer people treatments that are preventions that could actually forestall these kind of age-related diseases. But I applaud you for your work.
We're going to let Olivia ask one more, then you're cut off.
Okay, this one I'm going to refer to my husband, he had the best question ever. Thanks. Ah, you're so shy. Okay, he was talking about how do we actually get to recognize the symptoms of like aging and when it's happening, and like incorporating that into the study so we can actually see like in real time when aging is actually happening.
Yeah. Well, you know, you point out another major problem is that even if metformin and or rapamycin are shown to really reduce the progression of these chronic diseases and disabilities, you as an individual are not going to feel the effect. We're only able to perceive the effect when we do these large studies. We can say on average, the population that got the drug did better in terms of whatever the measure might be. But you're not going to know, because these drugs typically will not make any difference in how you feel. They may make some significant difference in how you progress, but you're not going to have any comparison to know whether you were getting a benefit from that treatment. So that's another problem, and it's another reason in general that we have such poor adherence to medications. When it's for hypertension or even diabetes where we don't feel the symptoms and the drug doesn't have any effect on how we feel, we tend to let them go. And it's even worse if you're trying to prevent the aging process. The effects are going to be very subtle. Great
Okay,
question.
well, one last thank you to Zan Fleming, Dr. Fleming.